Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we'll continue our series on Android development with Kotlin by building our first application. In future videos, we'll get more and more complicated. The app we're building will take two inputs and combine them and display them in another view on the screen. This is a great foundation for understanding, and how this all works is a large portion of how most Android development is done. So once you understand this, future topics will make a lot more sense. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and start a new application. We're going to call this input output and make sure that the include Kotlin support checkbox is checked. And we can start with API level 15. And we're going to simply start with an empty activity. We can just accept the defaults here and hit finish. Okay, so once Gradle finishes its thing and everything is all set up for us, we're going to expand some of these folders just to get our basics set up. So here's our initial code file and then our layout here. So for the most part, when you build applications, you'll want to draw out sketches of the different screens and everything. Since this is a simple application, we're just going to start off with drawing it in the layout. So I'm going to start the layout here. So by clicking on this, it'll bring up our Hello World application that starts off from our template, and we have just a text view here that we're not going to need. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that by hitting the delete key, and now we're left with an empty screen. So as I mentioned, we're going to have two inputs. We're going to make these edit texts, and so if you see this palette here on the left, you can filter it out by text items or general widgets such as progress bars or what have you. And so you can explore these and see what we have capable of displaying in Android. And once you kind of learn one, they all kind of work very similar to each other. So let's get started by showing you a few of these. Now I'm just going to drag in a plain text here. And what we're going to build is just a simple name, first name, last name form field. And it's just going to combine those names together into another text field. So I'm going to drag these two together. Let's say put it right here, and then we're going to have a display. Let's maybe drag that right here, and this is going to be where we display both the first name and the last name. And of course, to do that, to combine those together, we're going to need a button. So I'm going to go back to all here, and I'm going to go down here and find button, which is at the top, and I'm going to put it somewhere, let's say right around there. Looks good. All right, so once we have these on the screen, these are not the way that it's going to look when we compile the application. So if I immediately hit the play button here, we don't have any code written, but it should have our UI widgets on the screen. All right, and once our emulator pops up with our application, you can see that the UI looks nothing like what we have laid out here. And that's because we don't have any layouts explicitly defined for our widgets here. And what's happening is these widgets actually move down to what the parent layout is saying. And if you look over here, we just have this constraint layout. And what that's going to do is basically move all of these UI widgets up to the top left-hand corner, which is what you see over here. They're just stacked on top of each other. And so that's obviously not what we want. So let me introduce you to layouts. What I'm going to do is go down to layouts on the side of our palette here, and I'm going to drag out a linear layout vertical, which is this one here. And I'm going to, instead of dragging it on here, which I can certainly do, I'm actually going to drag it into this hierarchy, this component tree, and I'm going to drag it right below the constraint layout. We can drag it anywhere in between these guys. So that didn't do anything, but if I click on this one, hold shift, click on these other ones, I'm going to drag all these underneath the linear layout. And so make sure it's under there, it's not under constraint layout or anything, just over top of linear layout, and release. And that'll drag everything in between there. Now, as you can see, everything has changed its order. And that's because the linear layout will render our UI elements, such as our button and our edit texts, in the order of our hierarchy. So in other words, our button comes first, and because this is a vertical linear layout, it's going to lay out our button first. And so if I just simply click on our button and then click and drag it down to, let's say, well, we could just drag it to the bottom and then drag our text view down below that. You can see how that order changes. Okay, so this is looking a little bit more like we had it originally. The next thing I want to do is actually want to have this button not fill up the entire width. And so right now the layout width is set to match parent. I can set it to match content, and you can see that it's going to wrap the content of what the button content is, and the button content is just defined by the name of the button. So right now it's button. So with the button selected, if we go right here on the right hand side, and if for some reason you don't see these panels, sometimes they can be hidden, and this is going to be the attributes of this button. We can change the text of it, and I'm just going to hit combine, and we're going to combine the two edit texts above here and display it in our text view. Now every one of these needs IDs, so I'm going to actually go ahead and do that first. So I'm going to say this is first name edit text, and this one's going to be last name edit text. Our button we can just keep as button, or you can just do save button or combine button, whatever you want to do. Whatever makes sense. If you have multiple buttons, make sure you name it appropriately. And then I'm going to name this output text view. Okay, so now if we ran this should look almost exactly this way. But when I start to type in these edit texts, I'll have to delete what's in there first. And so certainly I don't want these pre-populated with values. So in our text attribute, I'm going to delete that. But instead, if I got rid of that, I don't know what to text here. I don't know what to enter in here as a user, and so you want to give your user a good hint of what to type in here. So I'm going to put in first name here. Don't hit enter because it's going to use the strings, which you should be using. And actually, let's go ahead and just do that, showing you the proper way. So that value comes from our strings file. So if you open up the values here on the left and go to strings, you can see that we have our app name as the only string in there. But for this one, I am going to put in as a new string, name, first name, hint, something like that. It doesn't really matter what you call it. And then paste in what we had. And I'm certainly going to do that for the last name, but give it a different name here. So this is going to be last name. I'm just going to combine all those there, give it a new value. And for our button, you can see how this is going to work. Combine button, we usually use underscores, and I'm just going to put the text in there. All right, so we're going to use these values here to refer to, back in our layout, the values that we want here. And this is a good way of making your text dynamic so that you can send off just this one XML file for translation. Okay, so once we have that saved in our strings file, we can go back here. I'm going to click on that first edit text, and under hint, we should be able to type in first name hint, and if it doesn't come up, we can always hit this ellipse and select it from our list here. Okay, so it's going to be @string / and then the name of it, and you can see that it's going to be this gray text. So as the user taps into this field and starts to type, that'll immediately go away, and if there's nothing in there and they tap off, it'll come back. So it just gives them a nice hint of what should be typed in there. And so we can certainly do string here and then last name if you want to do it that way. That's two ways of doing it. And of course we have to remove the default value for the text in that text edit text. And for our button, again, I'm going to get this text. So this is different from a hint. Obviously the buttons don't have hints, but we can do, well, let me just do it this way. And usually the custom values will come up here at the top. So sometimes I just do it that way. And then for our text view, what we can do is we can remove the default value here. We can also make it invisible from the start, and then once we have data to put in there, we can programmatically make it visible as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to make it invisible, and so at this point it doesn't actually matter. We can just go back and put text here, but you won't see it because it's invisible, and we can either change that to none or change it to visible, what have you. But again, it's going to be invisible by default. Okay, and that's really all we have to do to set up our UI here. And so you can explore the different layouts that we have. We have linear horizontal layout, which will lay out your UI elements from left to right. And you can also nest elements as well. So if I drag in a horizontal layout and maybe put it above our first name, It's going to shift everything off the screen because this layout's taking up the full height of the parent. But if I just do wrap content, there's no content in it, so it makes it as small as possible, which because there's nothing in there, it's going to make it 0. But if we drag something in there, like another, let's put another text view in there and just drag it right on top of the linear horizontal, you can now see that there is one text view in there. And let's actually add another one to show you how the linear one, and expand this out and drag it down there. So now we have two text views and they get laid out horizontally. So you can put in other things such as buttons, maybe put a button between the two layouts, and you can see how that works. Now, if you mess around with the weight of each item, let's say make this 2, you can see that it has a little bit more influence on how much space it takes up. But I'd be very careful in using that setting because different layouts will have, or different devices will have different layout consequences. So right now we're on the Nexus 4, which is a 4.7-inch screen at 768 by 1280. That's considered an XHDPI, and you can see all the different ones we want to set up. So if we want to do something more like a tablet, like a Nexus 10, and we click on that, what does that look like? Right now this is a horizontal view and it looks pretty terrible. I don't think I'd ever put this application on a tablet, but you can also rotate this back to portrait and see what your application looks like on a tablet, in portrait, in landscape. And again, that's this little button up here. So I'm going to switch back to the Nexus 4. But one thing that you might want to consider with the Android devices or the phones, what does it look like when you rotate it? So play around with that, make sure everything is looking good and there's no errors. I'm going to put that back to portrait. And I'm actually going to delete this entire layout because it doesn't add anything to our application. And then I'll return everything back to normal. Okay, so again, once we have our layout set up, now we can start implementing the code behind it. So if I go back to my main activity, we're going to get references to each one of those. Okay, so we're going to create some class variables here. So for the two edit texts that we're going to enter in the first name and last name, I'm going to need a late init var for that. So we're going to have first name edit text, and that's going to be of type edit text, of course. And then we're going to have a late init. We just copy this whole line and just change first name to last name. Okay, so those are our two input fields. And then we're going to also have another late init var for our button. So I'm going to call this combine button, and that's of type button. And then finally we have our output text view of type text view. All right, great. So obviously none of these are instantiated, so let's go ahead and do that really quickly. Now it's a lot of glue code that will show you how to speed that process up in future videos using a third-party library. But we're just going to copy and paste all this stuff in here. So find view by ID to get the ID. And now if this is new to you, you can check out previous videos that we did on Kotlin setting all this up. But we're going to refer to those IDs that I defined. So we have first name, edit text. And again, I'm just going to copy everything here. Paste that there. I'm just going to go ahead and paste that as well. And then change our IDs. So our last name here, combine button here, and then finally our output text view. So it helps to name your IDs from your layout the same as your Kotlin variables inside of your class, just so you know exactly which ones match up, and you could do this pretty easily without having to think about it. Okay, so if we go back to our application layout really quickly, what essentially our application code is going to need to do is it's going to need to grab the value out of this first edit text and then the second edit text, combine those when we hit that combine button, and then output it to our text view, as well as make that text view visible. Okay, so those are the steps we need to do. I'm going to lay that out in code real quick, in pseudocode I mean. So get two values from our edit text. Step, let me see, I'll make that step 1. Step 2, on combine, click. These are really taps, but Android calls them clicks. And then third, I'll just break this out as a second option. We're going to output to the output field, make it visible. Okay, so let's start filling in these steps with code. Now, all this needs to happen within that combined click. So we're going to first make sure that we have a click listener on our button. And so again, that just means that when you tap on it, that we get a callback or we get code that executes when that happens. And so to do that, we type in combine button, set on click listener, and we're going to choose this second one. And what this is going to do is give us what's called a lambda. And the lambda is just going to be an empty block that we can put code into. And that's all we need for this particular case. So I'm going to hit enter to put this on a new line. And let's actually move up our code here. And if I hit the command shift and up, it'll move all the highlighted code lines up into my function. So I'm going to hit that one more time to move it up. And of course you can move it down. So this is a really handy function. Again, that's command shift up and down. Or if you're on Windows, I believe it's Control Shift up and down. All right, so step one, we're going to combine two values from our text field or our edit texts. So I'm just going to actually copy these, paste those down there, get rid of those just so I have those. And then we're going to get the text out of it. Okay, just like that. And of course, we're going to combine these together. So we're simply just going to use the concatenation. However, if we do this, it's going to squash in those two names together. And so what's going to happen is we're going to need to put a space in between these. So we're going to use a string interpolation for this. So we would do string, and then if I do a $, it just takes this first variable and spits it out, and then uses the rest as a string literal. And that's not what we want. So we want to combine everything in curly braces when we do this. And we're going to use this as our space, $, curly brace, and curly brace. So again, it'll evaluate this entire variable as it is, and then spit it out into a string. And of course, we need to combine that into our output string, which is of type string. So I hope you see what we're doing here. We're just taking the two string values, we're adding a space between them, and then we're going to combine the entire thing into output string here. Okay, so that's step one. So of course we already did step two by being in here, so maybe this should have been command shift space up. As they say, comments are just future lies. And so actually I'm going to move this one up as well. So command shift up. All right, and then finally for the output here, we're going to use our output text view that we have. We're going to set its text to that variable that we have. Of course, we can just set it to this guy as well, but we're not going to do that in this case. And then finally, we're going to make it visible. So output text view dot visibility, and you can hit control space on that and just see that the visibility is actually going to be an int. I don't know if you saw that. So this is an, as I said, this is an int, and so it's going to expect a constant here, which is not necessarily true or false, but more of a enumerated type that we can set these to. Because if we go back to our activity main here, and I go back to our visibility dropdown, you can see that we have not just true and false or visible, invisible, but we also have gone. If you select gone, what ends up happening is it looks like it's as if the view itself is not within the view hierarchy. So everything shifts up. But if we simply make it invisible, you can see it's not visible, of course, but it also keeps the area that it takes up normally. So it's just not being displayed. However, it's still taking up that space. So because we have multiple options here, we can't just do true or false. Actually, let me set that back to invisible. We can't just set that to true or false. We have to actually set it to, as I said, a enum on this. So we get the constant by just typing in view, because all these items are views. So we can do this on our text views, our buttons, etc. And then do view.visible. We also have view.invisible. And you can see the type for that is an int. And then we can do view.gone, which is also another int. And I'm not really sure what those ints evaluate to, but you can look at those up if you want to. So I'm just going to change that back to visible. Okay, so that's how you change visibility in Android. Okay, so hopefully all this made sense to you. If not, watch the previous videos on Android development. All right, and before we run this, I realized that I did not set the button. I set that invisible. I was just playing around with it. I meant to set it back to visible. I set it to invisible. So again, make sure everything looks great here. I'm going to go ahead and now run this application. And switching over to our emulator, you can see that we have our input here. So I'm going to type in, I'm going to tap in here, and it's going to bring up our keyboard. So I'm just going to type in our name. Or you can do a little bit faster by typing on your keyboard, and even tab works. Okay, so once we have our two inputs here, we can hit combine, and sure enough, that text view comes up and changes our text, and we can change all sorts of different things here. We do more stuff here. We can type in more text and then combine those two together. So this is the essence of Android development. So once you start getting input from the user, you can start doing something very useful with that data and then giving feedback or output to the user. This may seem like a very simple concept, but again, it's going to be the foundation of how most of the Android applications that you build are going to work. Now, obviously, in future videos, we're going to introduce you to more advanced widgets and techniques and other things, such as getting data from the internet, pulling it into your app, and then parsing through that. But instead of getting that information from an edit text, we can get it from a web service or something similar. And so the concepts that you just learned are very similar to how much more complex operations work. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel to see future videos on Android Kotlin development, as well as other topics we have in this channel, such as iOS development, server development, game development, and much, much more. Make sure you like this video if you want to see more of this content, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.